Ms. Sanchez, whenever you're ready, we can start the meeting.
Okay, I'll call this meeting of the Corporate Governance Committee to order. Can we go ahead and have the announcements read?
Yes, thank you, Ms. Sanchez. This meeting is being conducted as a virtual meeting, so I will do a roll call of the trustees to confirm attendance. Ms. Sanchez,
Here.
Mr. Knox.
Good morning, I'm here.
Good morning. Mr. Santos, he's absent. Ms. Greenwood and Mr. Green. Okay,
Do we have a quorum?
we do not. So let me just send out a quick text real quickly.
Okay. I don't believe we have anything that requires action.
Actually, hold on one second. Hold on. Mr. Green is going to be joining right away. Hold on one second.
Greenwood has joined the meeting.
Okay. Ms. Greenwood, can you hear me? Ms. Greenwood?
Good morning.
Good morning. Oh, thank you. Okay, I'm going to call the remaining of the trustees. Mr. Kehoe? Ms. Jones? Mrs. Jones, are you there? Okay.
I'm
Mr.
present.
Kelly? Thank you. Mr. Kelly?
Good morning, I'm here.
Thank you. And Mr. Jones? Okay. 1 second.
Apparently, we're all straggling just a little tiny bit.
Staff participating in the meeting include the following: CIO John Grable, CEO Santos Grayman, Chief Counsel Stephen Rice, and investment staff Scott Drazen and Dale Johnson. Consultants include the Makita Investment Group, and we have a guest speaker today, Janine Gillett, who is the Chief Executive Officer of Value Reporting Foundation. Trustees, please use the Zoom chat option to be placed in the queue. At this time, we ask all meeting participants to mute their mics until they're ready to speak, and you may not proceed with the agenda.
Okay, thank you. So just to clarify, do we now have a quorum or are we still not at quorum?
We do have a quorum.
Fantastic, thank you. So let's move on to the approval of the minutes.
So moved.
Thank you. Do I have a second?
Keith, I'll second.
Thank you, Keith. We'll take a roll call.
Thank you. Ms. Sanchez?
Yes.
Mr. Knox?
Aye.
Ms. Greenwood?
Aye.
Mr. Green? Okay, the motion passes unanimously.
Great. Let's move on to our first, to the consent items. I'm sorry, do we have, skipping ahead here, do we have any public comment?
We do not have any public comments.
Okay, now let's move on to the consent items. Mr. Rice, or no, Mr. Rice?
I have no presentation. It's necessary
Oh.
for the committee to take action on this, though, because it's been more than 30 days since our last meeting, and the board meeting is after this meeting, hence the committee has to act.
Got it. So I will take a motion.
Move approval.
Move approval.
Okay.
I'll
thank you.
second Keith's motion.
Thank you. Our intrepid committee working hard. We'll take a voice roll call.
Thank you. Ms. Sanchez?
Yes.
Mr. Knox?
Aye.
Ms. Greenwood?
Aye.
Okay, the motion passes unanimously.
Okay, let's move on to our first report. Very excited to hear our educational presentation this morning. Scott, do you want to give a brief introduction?
I'd be happy to. Good morning, Madam Chair and trustees. Report 5A is an educational update on the global state of ESG corporate reporting and related frameworks, for which we're honored to have guest speaker Janine Gillett of the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, or SASB, as it's also known, and Janine's also the newly appointed special advisor to the International Accounting Standards Body, the IFRS's newly formed International Sustainability Standards Board, whom I'll introduce more fully in a moment. I'd like to start with this attachment 2 in the materials because we recognize that we have a mix of tenures among the trustees here today. So just want to level set how we got here. As trustees are aware, LACERA's investment policy explicitly recognizes that environmental, social, and corporate governance factors, also known as ESG, can impact a company's risk and return profile and ultimately our portfolio holdings enterprise value, their ability to generate sustainable cash flow. This recognition wasn't first incorporated into LACERA's investment beliefs in 2016. About 5 years ago, the committee hosted an educational series exploring ESG research and various strategies to inform how LACERA might further elevate and expand the fund's integration of ESG into the investment process. So that first peg of the timeline there includes that Janine spoke with the committee as part of that series. And after that educational series, the committee and board harmonized and refreshed LACERA's guiding corporate governance and stewardship principles to further cover ESG factors that can be incorporated into our investment process, including various environmental and social matters. The principles now explicitly call on companies to provide timely, reliable, comparable reporting of all material performance factors that can provide investors with insights on their propensity to create and sustain value. That performance reporting is not just limited to financials, but also any material ESG factors. LACERA advocates its principles, not just in our proxy voting passively, but also through proactive engagement, engaging companies and policymakers. And this committee reviewed in 2018 4 core priorities for that engagement program, including encouraging credible, pragmatic strategies to improve the availability and quality of ESG corporate disclosures that companies give to investors so that we can make more informed investment decisions on ESG risks that the company's business strategies might face. So to advance that aim, in 2019, LACERA endorsed 2 frameworks in particular, including SASB. SASB sets industry-specific evidence-based ESG standards across 77 industries, recognizing that what's most financially relevant in the banking sector might be different from the mining sector, for example. Support for SASB has grown significantly, with investors representing over 73 trillion in assets. And Janine will speak more to that. LACERA has also endorsed the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which is an initiative of the Financial Stability Board to guide how companies report on climate risks. As mentioned earlier, the last peg of that timeline is that the IFRS launched in late last year a new ISSB, International Sustainability Standards Board, which will absorb SASB and the TCFD to establish a global baseline to facilitate not just simplifying ESG reporting, but also expanding ESG reporting across the market. So in the wake of recent committee discussion, we recognize there are a lot of acronyms here, and it can be a variable alphabet soup, but the growth, scale, and significant developments in ESG reporting merit a deeper dive. We also know from conversations with our external asset managers that a lot of LACERA's managers are using SASB as a tool to help guide what's most financially relevant. So we're grateful to have Janine Gilliatt here today. Janine has extensive history in the investment industry, both at Barclays and Bank of America. She also worked at CalPERS as the Chief Operating Investment Officer. Under her leadership as CEO, SASB has grown significantly, consolidated with other initiatives under the Value Reporting Foundation umbrella, and is now forming the baseline for the IFRS's new ISSB. Janine will walk through the rationale for ESG reporting trends and what the consolidation efforts mean for the market and investors like LACERA going forward. She's also agreed to be available for some Q&A afterwards. So Janine, thank you very much for joining us, and the mic is yours.
Thank you, Scott, and it's wonderful to be back in front of this committee. And as Scott showed with his timeline, it's been unbelievably rapid progress towards a global baseline of sustainability disclosure standards. And I want to acknowledge LACERA's leadership and role in making that happen, and especially the role that both Jonathan and Scott have played through the Investor Advisory Group. It's been investors like you that have really contributed to such rapid progress. So let me take a step back if we go to the next slide. And I'm going to talk a little bit about why we're even talking about sustainability disclosure and why it's important. And what you've heard over the last few years is just growing investor focus on integrating sustainability factors into investment decision making. And if we go to the next slide, what's driving that? What's really driving that is the changing nature of corporate valuations. And if you go back to the 1970s, corporate valuations were largely composed of tangible assets. Traditional financial accounting was very designed around cash flows from tangible assets. And over the last decades, that has dramatically changed, where the bulk of corporate valuations are now often largely driven by intangibles. And in that environment, investors need a broader information set to evaluate risk and return. So whether you call those ESG factors or operating metrics or sustainability factors, the bottom line is that investors need a broader information set than traditional financial accounting to evaluate risk and return. So if we go to the next slide. So the SASB standards really evolved to meet that information needs of investors for a broader information set. And what they do is they provide investors with comparable information on the sustainability factors that are most relevant to financial performance and to enterprise value. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how they do that. So if we go to the next slide. There are 6 key words to remember about the SASB standards. One is financially material, meaning the standards identify the sustainability factors most likely to impact financial performance or the value of a company. They're intended to provide decision useful information to investors, cost effective for companies to provide, and they're industry specific, because exactly as Scott mentioned, what's relevant in mining is different from what's relevant in banking, which is different from what's relevant in media or telecom. So they're industry specific. And then the standards are developed using a process that's roughly modeled after the process used to develop accounting standards. And that's a process that's evidence-based and market informed. If we go to the next slide. So what do we mean by financial materiality? What we mean is identifying ESG factors reasonably likely to have a significant effect on the financial condition, operating performance, or market valuation of the typical company within an industry. And in our standard setting process, what that requires is that an issue or a topic is of interest to investors. Investors want to have information on this issue, like greenhouse gas emissions. And we through an evidence-based process, can demonstrate that that topic does impact market value or enterprise value of a company. If we go to the next slide. So from day one, the SASB standards were designed to be focused on communication to investors. There are many sustainability disclosure frameworks. Some of them are focused on disclosure to multiple stakeholders, to employees, to customers, to civil society. The SASB standards are focused solely on communication to investors. And the goal ultimately is to have the sustainability information from the SASB standards combined with financial information from traditional financial accounting standards and combine that into core communications to investors, whether that is an annual report or an integrated report, but so that investors have all the information that's relevant for decision-making in one core document or location. If we go to the next slide. And the reason that's so important is what we're really trying to get to is comparable, consistent, and reliable information. One of the biggest challenges that investors have today is they can't access complete data sets. And we believe that generally accepted standards, just like we have generally accepted accounting standards, generally accepted sustainability disclosure standards are the path to consistent, comparable, and reliable data for investors. So what I'm going to do now is go a little deeper into the standards development process. And if we go to the next slide and tell you how that works. Well, first, I mentioned that the SASB standards are industry specific. We set standards for 77 industries, and that's governed by our sustainable industry classification system, which has grouped industries together that have like sustainability profiles. And if we go to the next slide, and what the standards do is they cover a broad set of sustainability issues. So sometimes when people hear the word sustainability, they think climate or they think environment. We define the word sustainability more broadly to mean the full range of issues that could impact the long-term value of a company. And we group those into 5 key, what we call dimensions: the environment, social capital, human capital, leadership and governance, and business model and innovation. And so our standard setting process starts with this universe of sustainability issues and then filters to identify the issues that are most relevant for specific industries. So if we go to the next slide, you can think about it as a funnel. Think about it as we start with a broad universe of sustainability issues that could potentially impact value. Then we have a research process that looks for evidence of how those issues impact value in specific industries. We get extensive market input from both investors and companies about their views on what impact value. And then ultimately, we issue exposure drafts of standards for public comment, and the final decisions are made by a standards board, an independent standards board that's modeled after the boards that set accounting standards, the International Accounting Standards Board, and in the US, the Financial Accounting Standards Board. So it's a very rigorous process, transparent, and includes multiple rounds of market feedback. If we go to the next slide. So that's a little bit about the standard setting process. What I'm going to do now is talk about investor support for the SASB standards and the significant rate of market adoption we've seen in the last few years. So if we go to the next slide. So SASB's investor advisory group, of which LACERA is a member, has been a major driver of corporate adoption of the SASB standards. The investor advisory group is 61 global asset owners and asset managers that are calling for foundational levels of ESG disclosures using the SASB standards. It's over 50 trillion in assets. Our IAG members. There's actually a larger number of investors who use the SASB standards in decision-making, over 70 trillion in assets, and very global. Although SASB did start in the US, we have strong global investor support for our work. And what unites all of these members of the IAG, who in some ways are quite different, they have different investment strategies, different philosophies, but what unites all of the members of the IAG is an understanding that ESG disclosure is a market infrastructure problem that investors need to work together and have a common voice to solve. So if we go to the next slide. This just shows you that broader how rapid investor support for the SASB standards is, and this is the broader universe of not only investor advisory group members who are most active and vocal supporters, but also investors who use the SASB standards in investment decision making. And it's now over 200 firms, 24 countries, 73 trillion in assets under management. And you can see the rapid growth there. If we go to the next slide. And then some of the things that have been most influential in terms of driving adoption of the SASB standards have been public policy statements from both asset owners and asset managers. What we've shared on this slide are calls from BlackRock, from State Street, from CPP Investments in Canada. Your own policy statement is another example of this. And there are dozens examples of policy statements of investors, both asset owners and asset managers, supporting both TCFD and SASB. And the reason why this is so important is that it's very important that companies receive a consistent message, because one of the things companies are very frustrated about is they feel like they hear a lot of different messages from investors for different things. And so companies are left they're not sure what to do. And so the coalescing of the investor voice around calling for TCFD and SASB has been incredibly important in making forward progress. We go to the next slide. And this shows you the results. And again, huge thanks to Scott and Jonathan for their leadership here. But this shows you that we now have, we started with a real goal around having large cap companies in developed markets adopt the SASB standards under a theory that if large cap companies started, the rest of the world would follow. And you can see our adoption rates right now. Over 50% of the global S&P 500 now report to the SASB standards, and that has been very rapid progress in a very short period of time. If we go to the next slide. So all of that, everything I just talked to you about, has really laid the groundwork for the ISSB, the International Sustainability Standards Board, which is our path to a global baseline of investor-focused sustainability disclosures. So let me talk about the ISSB for a bit. And if we go to the next slide. Before we dive deep into standard setting, let me talk a little bit about the broad landscape. And one thing that differentiates sustainability from traditional financial accounting is that financial accounting is a broadly understood ecosystem with lots of players, but the roles are clearly understood. So most people understand the role of the FASB, the Financial Accounting Standards Board. They understand the role of Standard & Poor's or Moody's in providing credit ratings. But in the sustainability landscape, all these acronyms are jumbled and no one understands what role, what organization's playing. So we created this slide to try to clarify the roles of different players. And the first column on this slide are what you could broadly call this framework and standard setters. They are organizations that publish guidance for voluntary disclosure. That's where SASB fits, that's where TCFD fits. Then there are organizations that request data from companies via questionnaires, and there are organizations that aggregate publicly available data from companies and then make that available to investment managers. That's where people like Bloomberg or Refinitiv fit. And then finally, there are organizations that create assessments or rankings of companies based on public or private information and sell that to investors. That's where organizations like MSCI, Sustainalytics, FTSE fit. And so what we're rapidly moving toward is a maturation of this ecosystem where people understand the roles of the players. But what happens is in financial accounting, a very similar ecosystem exists for financial data, but it's all underpinned by generally accepted accounting standards that are then companies use generally accepted accounting standards, companies put that information into the public domain, and that information is sourced by a whole ecosystem of data aggregators and raters and rankings. What we're trying to accomplish is getting sustainability data to that same foundational level of quality with generally accepted accounting standards so that this ecosystem has access to high quality data. If we go to the next slide. The parallel track with all of the market-based adoption and use that we've been talking about is intense focus on policy and regulation around the world, and a move towards mandatory sustainability disclosure, especially for climate around the world. Now, this is generally a very positive development. The downside, though, is that there is a risk of very fragmented regulatory disclosure happening around the world, and therefore investors will not get access to that consistent comparable baseline. And that is why we are so focused on the ISSB as an organization that can set international standards that can be a global baseline that can then be used by regulators around the world. So if we go to the next slide. So what is the ISSB? The International Financial Reporting Standards Foundation, IFRS Foundation, is the parent of the International Accounting Standards Board, sets accounting standards that are used in over 140 countries. At COP26 in November, the IFRS Foundation made 3 significant announcements. They're going to establish the ISSB. They're going to effectively acquire 2 organizations, one of which is my organization, including the SASB standards. And they published 2 prototype requirements documents that could ultimately become exposure drafts of ISSB standards. These were very, very big announcements, especially the consolidation of several organizations to help create the ISSB. If we go to the next slide. So what these announcements do is together they create the institutional arrangements. Those are through the consolidations of several existing organizations. And they lay the technical groundwork. That was the publication of prototype requirements documents to create a global sustainability disclosure center for the financial markets. And I've been in this space a long time. I can tell you, I think this is the most significant development in accounting standard setting and in, just call it broadly, investor information in decades. Very, very significant development. So if we go to the next slide. Why did we agree to be consolidated into the IFRS Foundation? A few things. One, we were trying to be very responsive to market demand for rationalization and simplification of the space. There is enormous frustration among companies about what's often called the alphabet soup of all these different disclosure frameworks. And we wanted to be responsive to market demand. We did believe that the only way to simplify the landscape was organizational consolidation. And we also thought that there were too many organizations competing for resources in this space, and that if we consolidated and we'd have fewer organizations with more resources, more scale, that could have more impact faster. So that was the rationale for our agreement to be consolidated into the IFRS Foundation. Next slide. This just tells you a little bit more about IFRS. As I mentioned, they set international accounting standards. They will create a sister board, the International Sustainability Standards Board. What's most important about this slide is that although the IFRS Foundation is a private organization, it's actually a US nonprofit, it has a governing board, the IFRS Foundation Monitoring Board, that oversees the trustees, that is composed of regulators, securities regulators and other regulators from around the world. And the US SEC sits on the IFRS Foundation Monitoring Board. So it's that oversight by the securities regulators that gives the IASB standards really their clout, for want of a better word, to be implemented in 140 jurisdictions around the world, because they're supported by the securities regulators. And we hope to see the same dynamic for the sustainability standards. If we go to the next slide. What will the ISSB do? It will develop a global baseline of sustainability disclosure standards, focused on meeting the information needs of investors through the lens of how sustainability issues impact enterprise value. So very consistent with what the SASB standards do today. And it will enable companies to provide comparable, consistent, and reliable sustainability information for the capital markets. And then our hope is that those ISSB standards will be used as a building block by regulators around the world, so that investors get this comparable information set globally. Next slide. So this is what it looks like. The IASB and setting accounting standards that govern the financial statements, ISSB setting standards for sustainability disclosure, and those two things combined give investors a comprehensive information set. Now, very importantly, this slide shows IFRS accounting standards governing the financial statements. In a US context, think of it as US GAAP governs the financial statements, but we are designing the sustainability standards to be accounting agnostic, so they can be used with either IFRS or US GAAP. If we go to the next slide. And then the ISSB just issued exposure drafts of its first two standards. This is very, very exciting. One on climate-related disclosure that builds on both TCFD and SASB, and another one on general requirements for disclosure of sustainability-related information. The general requirements document is very significant. It requires disclosure of all material sustainability issues, and it references the SASB standards as a tool to identify material sustainability issues. If we go to the next slide. So this does ultimately give us a path to streamline disclosure for companies, what we're trying, and for investors who also struggle with understanding the landscape. We are definitely trying to simplify the alphabet soup, and the path to the things you know or may have heard of. TCFD recommendations ultimately land in the ISSB climate disclosure standard, as do many SASB related disclosures. The SASB standards ultimately become ISSB industry specific disclosure requirements, and the integrated reporting framework, which we have not talked about a lot, but provides very important context around governance and strategy and risk management, ultimately becomes a framework to provide those disclosures on an ongoing basis. All of that has to go through ISSB due process, so it will take some time, but there is a path to a global baseline of sustainability disclosure standards. If we go to the next slide. And then we often get asked, how does this relate to GRI, which is another existing disclosure framework that is focused on disclosure to multiple stakeholders about how a company's actions impact society. And this nested materiality graphic really lays out the concept that there are three layers of information. There's traditional financial accounting governed by accounting standard setters. There is sustainability related financial disclosure. That's disclosure about sustainability issues that could impact enterprise value. That is the purview of the ISSB. And then there is broad multi-stakeholder disclosure to customers, employees, civil society, and about a company's particularly contributions to sustainable development. And, oh, excuse me, that's the purview of the GRI standards. If we go to the next slide. So I'll just wrap it up there. I know I've given you a ton of information. I've walked through, 5 or 6 years of work in, a handful of slides, but I just want to close by reiterating what a significant accomplishment this is in order to be on the cusp of a standards board, International Sustainability Standards Board, to set standards for disclosure of sustainability factors to investors. And just want to thank you again for the leadership role that LACERA has played in getting us to this point. So with that, Scott, I'll hand it back to you.
Well, thank you very much for the update, and obviously all of SASB's good work, which has helped facilitate expanding LACERA's aim to hopefully have good quality available data in the marketplace. So I'll turn it back over to our chair to guide further discussion.
Thank you, Janine. That was very interesting. And this is definitely a topic that we are all watching with great and keen interest. So thank you for all your very hard and diligent work, because that's what makes this go forward. And the sooner we can get to consistent baseline agreement on what materiality is, what needs to be disclosed, what should be disclosed, the sooner we will get to being able to get to a more sustainable world. So very much appreciate it. We do have one question from Mr. Knox.
Thank you very much, Chair Sanchez. An excellent presentation. It really helped me better understand the alphabet soup that I've been struggling with for a while. So thank you. I'm also trying to better understand then the disclosure process. You know, when I think of accounting standards, I think of external auditors and reports and consistency along those lines. Are these disclosures all just voluntary? And you mentioned on slide 12 as part of that timeline and rigorous process, evidence vetting. So I was just trying to understand, is it all voluntary disclosure? How do you vet that? How do we ensure consistency?
Yeah, so those are great questions. So today, the standards are voluntary. One of the biggest benefits of SASB consolidating into the IFRS Foundation is that the IASB, the accounting standards set by the IASB, are mandated in various ways in over 140 jurisdictions to differing degrees. And so it's a separate process in every major market to turn the IFRS standards from voluntary to mandatory. And it has to work through a usually country-specific process based on that country's legal and regulatory framework. And the real value, or one of the key values of the IFRS Foundation entering in this space, is they have experience working through that process with 140 jurisdictions around the globe. So we definitely see a path to the standards becoming mandatory in many, many markets. But there's also a path to, the other thing I want to talk about that you mentioned is quality of information. And so the standards have always been, both SASB standards and now the ISSB standards will be designed to be assurable. There are certain criteria that standards need to meet in order to be assurable. And so we definitely want the information to be assurable. And the other thing we're always very clear on is that we recommend that companies use the same systems of internal control and board governance and oversight for sustainability information as they use for financial information, because that's the ultimate path to high quality information, is internal control and board governance and oversight.
Thank you. And then what is that timeline, just generally on slide 12, start to finish? Does that, become more efficient, quicker as time goes by, or as there's more information, does that expand a little?
Yeah, that it definitely becomes more efficient as time goes by, because you get better at just get better at the process. Having said that, as we expand the number of people, the number of organizations who are going to be interested in sustainability disclosure, because it's looking like it's becoming mandatory, that can definitely lengthen the process, because it's heavily dependent on number of consultation responses. And I think what we're going to see is significantly more interest in responding to consultations on sustainability disclosure in the future than we've seen in the past, because as it's more likely the disclosures will become mandatory, just more people are going to get interested in participating in the process.
Oh, excellent. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Okay, thank you. Are there any last questions? Looks like we have a question from Ms. Jones.
Thank you for that explanation. I had a similar question as Committee Member Knox. But my additional question is, will we get to a point where, in the finance world, we have auditors who issue qualified and non-qualified opinions? Will we get to a place where there's some form of ranking or some way of identifying, whether a company is meeting most of the standards, or is there some way that we're going to be able to assess that in written form.
Definitely, definitely. And it may be, it's a bit of ways away, Ms. Jones, but one of the most active areas around auditing standards development right now is continuing to evolve the auditing standards for assurance of sustainability information. And there's a whole discussion about levels of assurance, which is not my technical area of expertise, just to be very clear. So, but there's a whole discussion about levels of assurance and auditing standards and how you apply those concepts to sustainability information.
Thank you.
Super. Any final questions? Okay, so with that, thank you very much, Janine, for your presentation this morning, and we look forward to continuing to work together. Moving on to our next item on our agenda, we have a brief spotlight on select topics, which is good because we have very little time left, but I will hand it over to Mr. Drazel to take us through our brief spotlight on topics for the proxy season.
Great, thank you, Madam Chair. Report 5B, we can start on slide 2 of the attachment. Dale and I will walk through this report, which is intended to very briefly provide the committee with some insights on 3 dynamic, evolving corporate governance topics that we want to apprise the committee of as we dive into the always busy proxy voting season this spring. Slide 3, please. As quickly summarized on slide 3, all of LACERA's proxy voting and broader stewardship efforts are guided by our corporate governance stewardship principles as established by this committee and approved by the board. The committee significantly updated those principles in recent years, and they now cover the full range of topics that are common on corporate proxies that we vote. Staff has reviewed the anticipated topics that are likely to come up this season and believe the principles remain robust, credible, soundly forward-looking, and position LACERA to maintain high standards in our voting practices in a credible and pragmatic way throughout the proxy season. As noted on the right side of this slide, the principles guide our voting at about 8,000 shareholder meetings across 65 markets every year. 75% of those meetings occur between the months of April and June. As always, we'll compile and report the full proxy voting trends and results and statistics after the end of the fiscal year, which ends on June 30th. And we'll report those to the fall committee meetings so the committee has a full view of summary statistics and trend lines. But for today's report, we wanted to touch on 3 specific topics to keep the committee informed of some market developments and how the principles are being applied when voting. So let's move to slide 4. The first topic pertains to companies with multi-class share structures in which some investors are accorded greater weight to their votes than other investors. LACERA's principles call for the simple principle of 1 share, 1 vote, by which voting power should be proportionate to investors' economic interests. This principle is driven by the dynamic in which weighted voting can entrench some investors, often the company founders. Once established, weighting voting is difficult for investors to get rid of because of that innate voting power imbalance. And research indicates that there can be a market discount in valuations a few years after an initial public offering at multi-class companies. LACERA's principles also call on us to hold directors accountable when firms have poor governance practices that may not serve investors' interests. Despite such weighted voting structures being unpopular with investors, it remains a market practice by some companies, including notably 4 of the 12 largest by market cap in the US, such as Facebook, now known as Meta, and Google, now known as Alphabet. However, we are also seeing the emergence of some provisions that might counter perpetual differential voting provisions. For example, over half of the new IPOs that are coming to the market with these types of weighted voting rights now have sunset clauses by which weighted voting sunsets after a specified time period, typically after about 7 years. The Council of Institutional Investors, which we're active in, is advocating draft legislation that would require all new IPOs to have these types of sunset provisions going forward. Let's move to slide 5. LACERA votes proxies to support one share, one vote. We've supported shareholder proposals that request companies to end multi-class share structures, but these proposals face an uphill battle, of course, given that voting control embedded in the weighted voting structures. We've also opposed directors at new IPOs that come to the market with poor governance, such as differential voting. Now that the market is seeing more companies adopt investor protections like sunset provisions, we're also opposing incumbent directors of any company that maintains unequal voting rights, unless the company has in place compelling investor protections, such as these types of sunset provisions, by which that weighted voting is slated to end. While these votes only impact an estimated 2% of the director universe that we're voting, we think it's a meaningful way to apply LACERA's principles and encourage equal voting rights for all investors. I will turn to Dale for the next couple of topics.
Thank you, Scott. As noted on the top of slide 6, LACERA's principles call for boards to be composed of highly talented directors with the requisite mix of skills, competencies, attributes, as well as diverse backgrounds to oversee corporate strategy to create and sustain value. LACERA's aim to apply a consistent global approach to evaluating board diversity using information when and where it is available, and opposes directors when boards fail to demonstrate a credible track record of inclusion. Research continues to show that boards with broader levels of diversity are outperforming those with little or no diversity. And while board diversity is increasing around the world, most companies are still lagging in reaching critical mass. Board diversity disclosure is increasing, partly as a result of efforts by investors and in some cases regulators, but investors don't always have clear information from companies on what diversity attributes are represented on their boards. To attempt to fill in the gap, third-party data providers have been collecting data through analyzing website and company disclosures, director and company linkages, and company-focused surveys and engagement to supplement corporate proxy disclosures. Next slide, please. The increased company disclosures and data on board diversity are positioning LACERA with more information to evaluate boards on whether they indeed demonstrate a compelling track record of inclusion. As a result, LACERA is gaining more clarity on board composition to identify outlier boards who lack multiple directors of diverse backgrounds that meet LACERA's principles that boards show a compelling track record of inclusion. Consistent with LACERA's policy and past practice, we will continue to hold directors accountable where analysis indicates the company is a laggard. Based on our analysis and work with ISS, we've estimated that we'll likely vote against about 9% of directors leading nominating committees for poor records on casting a wide net, inclusive of multiple directors of diverse backgrounds. Next slide, please. LACERA's principles have long held that directors should be held accountable for material failures of governance, risk oversight, or fiduciary responsibilities relevant to a firm's ability to generate sustainable financial returns. We voted against directors for material failures of workplace safety at Boeing, for example, and at Wells Fargo's for compliance failures. And similarly, this season, we are scrutinizing firms that are lagging on explaining how climate change impacts their business models and whether they're mitigating those risks. LACERA is involved in a number of investor initiatives, such as SASB, that encourage companies to disclose potential risk and mitigation efforts related to climate change that could have an impact on firm performance and value. While some companies have demonstrated progress in providing the market with clearer information on how they intend to mitigate climate risk to their business strategies, other companies have been slow to disclose and explain their climate mitigation efforts. Regulators, such as the SEC, are stepping up with proposals to require climate-related disclosures from listed public companies, underscoring the need for firms to be positioned to address climate risks. Next slide, please. In this proxy season, consistent with LACERA's principles, LACERA is scrutinizing the highest risk companies on the extent to which they're addressing climate risks and may hold certain directors accountable if companies lack adequate disclosure on identifying, addressing, and mitigating potential climate-related risks on firm value and have lagged in responsiveness to investor engagement. We anticipate the overall impact on director elections will be minimal, since our focus will be on a small number of high-risk companies in the portfolio, and we won't know our votes until we analyze the corporate proxy disclosures as they come up for a vote. Next slide, please. So to conclude, LACERA's principles were constructed to provide robust, sensible, and sustainable guidance on proxy votes across markets over time. They remain efficacious even as corporate governance issues such as weighted voting rights, corporate board diversity, and board accountability of climate risks are dynamic and evolving due to investor and regulatory attention, increased corporate disclosures, and the proliferation of data and analysis tools. That concludes our presentation. We'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you. Do we have any questions from the committee? So I will make an observation that I am always very pleased to see that our efforts are always aligned with our policies, and I look forward to seeing the results from the proxy voting as it happens. And thank you to Scott and Dale. Keep fighting the good fight, and we will see how it turns out at the end of the proxy season. So thank you for this. So do we have any items for staff review?
We do not have any items.
Okay, good of the order.
I can call on the trustees, or you can go ahead and.
I was going to say, if anybody wants to speak up on good of the order. Well, I'll start by welcoming, since I get the first chance, welcoming Ms. Jones to our board. We look forward to working with you. And I will take a motion for adjournment.
So moved.
So moved.
Thank you. Apologies to the Equity Committee for only giving you 8 minutes.